The lethal injection began flowing at 6:02 p.m. Richard Barry Randolph's eyes remained closed as his face twitched slightly. Within minutes, the color drained from his features. When the warden shook him and shouted his name, there was no response. At 6:12 p.m. on November 20th, 2025, after spending 35 years on death row, the man who had once been a homeless veteran living in a dumpster was pronounced dead. Florida had just carried out its 17th execution of the year, more than double any previous record. But this execution was different. Just 3 years earlier, shocking documents had surfaced that would have changed everything about how we understand this case. Documents that revealed Richard Randolph's entire life had been built on a devastating lie. To understand what really happened that August morning in 1988, we need to start with a woman everyone in East Palatka knew. Minnie Ruth McCollum had worked at the Handyway convenience store on State Road 207 for so long that local kids who brought in recycled Pepsi bottles for 10 cents had grown up seeing her behind the counter. At 62, she'd been married for 47 years and had raised a son. She was the kind of manager who remembered your name, asked about your family, and sometimes gave people chances when nobody else would. 9 months before the murder, a desperate young man had walked into her store looking for work. Richard Randolph had been turned down everywhere else. He had no experience, no references, nothing that would make him a good hire. But Ruth saw something in him. Maybe it was the way he asked, or maybe she just believed everyone deserved a chance. She hired him on the spot. For the first few months, Richard proved her right. He showed up early, worked hard, stayed late. He was dedicated and responsible, everything Ruth had hoped for when she took that chance on him. He finally had steady income and managed to rent a small house. For perhaps the first time in his life, things were looking up. Then cocaine found him. Or maybe he found it, looking for something to quiet the screaming in his head that had been there since childhood. What started as occasional use spiraled fast. Within months, he couldn't pay rent. The small house was gone. The man Ruth had tried to help was now living in a dumpster behind the very store where he worked. She watched him deteriorate. He came in disheveled, irritable, sometimes hours late. Money went missing from the register. Ruth held on as long as she could, but eventually, she had to let him go. It was the hardest decision she'd made as a manager, firing someone she'd tried so hard to save. On the morning of August 15th, 1988, Richard rode his bicycle to the Handyway store before dawn. In his pocket was a toy gun, a child's plaything he thought would be enough to get what he needed. He wasn't planning to hurt anyone. He just needed money for his next fix. The safe had about $1,000. That would keep him going for weeks. But Ruth was already there, earlier than usual. When she saw him trying to open the safe, she confronted him immediately. That's when she noticed the gun in his hand wasn't real. She'd been around long enough to know the difference. She called him out on it. What happened next would take investigators years to fully piece together. The medical examiner would later say Ruth's injuries looked like someone who had been thrown from a motorcycle or ejected from a car. 334 separate bruises covered her body. The attack wasn't quick. Richard later confessed he had to go back to her 4 or 5 times because, in his words, she was much tougher than he thought. He beat her with his fists. When she kept fighting, he strangled her with the drawstring from his own sweatshirt. When she regained consciousness and screamed for help, he found a knife in the store and stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and head. Then, in a final act of degradation, he sexually assaulted her. He took her car keys, stole her vehicle, and locked the store behind him. At 7 a.m., 3 women arrived at the store, 2 employees and a regular customer. They found Richard locking the front door, wearing an employee's shirt he no longer had any right to wear. When they asked where Ruth was, he told them her car had broken down and he was going to pick her up. But something felt wrong. Through the window, they could see the security camera ripped from the ceiling, cables in the trash, the counter in complete disarray. They called the sheriff's office immediately. When deputies arrived, they had to break the glass door to get inside. They found Ruth in the back room, still breathing but unconscious, blood pooling from wounds to her head and neck. She would hold on for 6 more days in a coma before her brain injuries finally claimed her life. Richard was arrested that same day at a Jacksonville grocery store, trying to cash in lottery tickets he'd stolen from Ruth's store. When questioned, he confessed immediately and even showed police where he'd thrown his blood-stained clothes. The trial was swift. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Richard's defense attorney, who was also bizarrely designated as a special sheriff's deputy, called exactly one witness during the penalty phase. One witness to speak for a man's entire life. The jury never heard about the childhood that had shaped him. They never heard that Richard had been adopted at 5 months old into what one psychologist would later call a house of chaos and cruelty. His adoptive father beat him with belts, broomsticks, closed fists. He would lock Richard in dark closets for days at a time. His adoptive mother, battling severe mental illness and alcoholism, was hospitalized repeatedly for psychiatric care. She told him constantly that he was worthless, that nobody wanted him. By age 10, Richard was on medication for severe emotional disturbance. After high school, searching for structure and belonging, Richard joined the Army. He served honorably, but the military couldn't heal wounds that went soul deep. That's where he first turned to drugs, self-medicating trauma that nobody had ever addressed. The jury, knowing none of this, voted 8-4 for death. In any other state, that wouldn't have been enough. But in Florida, in 1989, you only needed a simple majority to send someone to die. Years later, the Supreme Court would rule this unconstitutional, but by then, it was too late for Richard. His sentence was already final. For 35 years, Richard filed appeal after appeal, all denied. During those decades on death row, something remarkable happened. He converted to Islam, taking the name Malik Abdul-Sajjad. He became a different man, mentoring younger inmates, mediating conflicts, studying his faith. His disciplinary record was spotless. Guards and fellow inmates alike respected him. But perhaps the most extraordinary revelation came in 2022, just 3 years before his execution. Newly released adoption records from New York revealed a truth that shattered everything Richard had believed about himself. His birth mother hadn't abandoned him. She was a 17-year-old girl who had given birth in a home for unwed mothers. Her parents forced her to give up the curly-headed, brown-eyed infant she'd named Barry. She believed he would go to loving parents who could give him the stable life she couldn't provide. That teenage girl went on to become a successful international banker. She had a loving marriage that lasted decades, and for 50 years, she searched for her son. When she finally found him in 2022, he was on death row. The reunion was bittersweet beyond words. She learned that instead of the better life she'd imagined, her baby had endured a childhood of unimaginable cruelty. By the time of his execution, Richard had developed systemic lupus, an autoimmune disease that made Florida's 3-drug lethal injection protocol especially painful. His lawyers argued this violated the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel punishment. The courts disagreed. On his last day, Richard woke at 4 a.m. He showered, met with a spiritual advisor. No family visited. His adoptive parents were gone, and his birth mother, now 80 years old, couldn't bear to watch. His last meal the night before had been simple: a double cheeseburger with lettuce and tomato, onion rings with ketchup, cherry pie with whipped cream. When they asked for his final words, Richard Barry Randolph, Malik Abdul-Sajjad, said nothing. He died in silence, taking with him a lifetime of pain that started before he could even walk. Sheriff Gator DeLoach, who attended the execution, said that day, "An evil life was finally extinguished way beyond his expiration date." He said he was there to bear witness for Ruth McCollum's family and friends. But Ruth's husband and son had already passed away. There was no family left to witness for. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Does understanding someone's pain excuse their actions? Absolutely not. Ruth McCollum deserved to live. She was a good woman who tried to help someone who ultimately destroyed her. Her death was senseless, brutal, unforgivable. But can we acknowledge that Richard Randolph was failed by every system meant to protect him, from the adoption agency that placed him in an abusive home, to the military that ignored his trauma, to the legal system that barely tried to understand his past? Can we hold two truths at once, that what he did was monstrous, and that he himself was once a victim? Florida executed its 17th person that November day, setting a modern record that Governor DeSantis seemed proud to achieve. 2 more executions were scheduled before year's end. The machinery of death in Florida has never been more efficient. But efficiency isn't justice. Justice would have been Ruth McCollum living to see her grandchildren. Justice would have been Richard getting help before cocaine took hold. Justice would have been that 17-year-old girl getting to raise her baby, instead of spending 50 years searching for him, only to find him waiting to die. Some will say Richard got what he deserved. Others will say the state simply repeated the cycle of violence that defined his entire life. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, in that uncomfortable space where mercy and justice collide. What do you think? Was this execution justified after 35 years? Or does killing a broken man who had transformed himself in prison simply add another victim to an already tragic story? The answer might say more about us than it does about Richard Randolph or even Ruth McCollum. Because in the end, this isn't just about one murder in a convenience store in 1988. It's about what kind of society we want to be, one that sees only the worst moment of someone's life, or one that can hold the full complexity of human failure and redemption. Ruth McCollum believed in giving people chances. The question is, when do those chances run out?